You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. My guest, Phil Elberg, is a happily retired civil attorney. A graduate of Brooklyn College and Rutgers University Law School, he spent a large portion of his career fighting and winning judgments, in total 6 million plus, for those harmed in the troubled teen program Kids. The most famous being the Lulu Corter case, and that's the topic of today's episode. Corter was admitted into Kids program at age 13 despite never having had a drink or a drug. She escaped out 13 years later, but during her time at Kids, she endured being restrained by the staff to the floor, humiliated and insulted during endless encounter therapy sessions known as RAP sessions, and she was cut off from all unsupervised communication with her family. But worst of all, she was denied an education. It is a case my guest Phil Elberg calls so unbelievable if it weren't true, no one would believe it. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Phil Elberg. So, how did Kids advertise itself, and what was the reality?
Kids arises, I guess, in the context of the tough love world and the tough love movement, which was actually sort of a formal movement then that arose at the same time as the Just Say No drug movement. It was really, all those things all happening at the same time. And so Miller Newton came to New Jersey from Florida, where he had been the person that was running this thing called Straight Incorporated. And I don't know how he got his first few kids into the program, but I think he started speaking at local schools, and he had the support of some politicians. There was some money behind him, some newspaper articles that I managed to get from the time when he first got started. And he got a few kids, and then he got a few more because it had a lot of appeal.
Yeah, I read those newspaper articles, and boy, were they love letter articles. The New York Times, magazines, newspapers. How did he get such good press?
I think there's lots and lots and lots of good press. There was a show on, I think Barbara Walters did a show extolling the virtues of his program, and the first book that he wrote called, I think It's Not My Kid, which ultimately became a TV movie starring George Segal, an actor you may or may not remember.
And Stockard Channing.
Yeah. So he was a little bit, I don't want to call him a budget celebrity, that may be too generous, but he got some notoriety and he had a lot of appeal. One of the things I think that was in the Dropbox material I sent you is a video he did, a promotional video in which he talked for about a half an hour in front of a group of people that he said were school administrators, but they were actually the parents of the kids that were in his program. And you get to see a lot of his appeal. He had the ability to appear to be empathetic, appear to be profoundly concerned, and appear to be the person that stood between a wonderful life with the kind of kid parents thought they had and a life of living either on the street as a drug addict or in jail. When I used to speak to the parents over and over again, they told me that you needed to understand why we put our kids there and left them there. You need to understand how convincing he was in making us believe that this decision to keep our kids in this program was the single thing that was saving our kids' life and preventing their lives and even the parents' lives from all falling apart completely. And he was very good at it.
What did he say his credentials were, and what was the reality?
So it changed a little bit over the years. When he first started Kids, he managed to call himself Dr. Miller Newton, and the doctor part was a big part of his appeal. That's a powerful word. And he could call himself Dr. Miller Newton because he had a doctorate in what he called medical anthropology from something called Union Institute, which was a college in Cincinnati. Online education is a big part of, education in our country now. It was not as big a part back in the late 70s and the early 80s when he got his degree in medical anthropology. But it was a school that was in something of turmoil at the time. And you didn't have to actually go to the school. You could do it all by correspondence, essentially. And when it came time to get your PhD, you picked the people that would review your material and decide whether you were qualified. So he came up with a committee that consisted of other people in the drug field. He did a study, a so-called study about Straight Inc., which was the program he was involved with in Florida, and he got a PhD. Later, he got a second PhD from the same school, this one in neuropsychology. And that was the degree he had when he published his book on adolescence, which was appeared to be a serious book published by a serious publisher, Norton Press, which is a serious publisher of academic works. And he had, a significant reputation at the time. So those were his degrees. Later, when he became a neuropsychologist, he then touted that and claimed to be this big expert in neuropsychology. And in fact, he wound up with privileges of at least one, maybe two New Jersey hospitals where he could come in and consult as a consulting, quote, neuropsychologist.
Did he present himself as a minister as well?
Yeah, he was. In fact, he had a degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. He had a master's degree from there, and he had been a youth minister or a minister at some church someplace. In fact, what he had been before he got involved in this drug work was a controversial politician in Florida, down in the part of Florida near Clearwater in Pinellas County. I think he had run for it, had been the Pinellas County clerk at one point, and he was well connected politically in a variety of ways in that part of Florida. Then what happened to him was he put his kid in the Straight program and had a meteoric rise till he was the, quote, national clinical director at Straight. And then what happened was, while he was at Straight became controversial and there were some problems down there. A man named Andrew McKelvey, who was the CEO of Monster.com, put his own kid or kids into the program and became convinced that Newton was a genius and had the answer to solving drug problems in youth. And so he gave Newton, I think, a couple of $1 million, either $1 million or $2 million, I'm not sure which, to leave Florida and come to New York to open up a program here. And their idea was that they would start in New York and then franchise it and wind up having these programs around the country. And so instead of New York, it didn't work, so they moved right on to the other side of the George Washington Bridge to Bergen County, and that's how Kids of Bergen County was created.
His wife also ran the program. What were her credentials, and what was her personality like?
Hers?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great question because she played such a prominent role at the trial and was a prominent person in the program. And if I can analogize, I'm not sure this may be interesting to you. If I can analogize to Nancy Salzman in the Nexium situation. In some ways it was a similar role. Nancy Salzman was much, much, much smarter than Mrs. Newton was, but she was the person that lots and lots of people dealt with, and she was their connection. If you ask Lulu's mother, Lulu had very few dealings over the years with Miller Newton, but Mrs. Newton kept her under control. She had a 2-year degree from a community college. Her grade point average was a C or something like it, as I recall.
1.6, yeah.
And she played a prominent role at the trial for me, and that was she was the deputy clinical director. She was presumably the second person in charge of running the program. And I haven't thought about her for a while, but she was a very important part of the trial because I called her as my first witness, as I recall, and I proved my case largely with her on the witness stand. And that was a tactical decision I made because she was such a fool and such an idiot and unable to answer any of the questions that I knew he would try to bullshit his way through. And so I thought the best way to describe, in effect, get to testify myself and tell the story was with her on the witness stand. And it worked out really well. I mean, she was as bad a witness as I expected.
Her answers allowed you to bring in some former kids. Can you talk about that? Former people who'd been through the kids program?
So that was a critical the single most important thing that happened in the trial had to do with getting that ruling from the judge, which allowed me to do that. There's an evidence principle. I haven't thought about this for a while, but I certainly knew this well, and I think I can recreate it for you. If I'm a driver and I hit somebody who's crossing the street, and I say he was a jaywalker who walked right in front of my car, and he says, no, I was acting normally and crossing at the light. If I can show that the day before he had also jaywalked in the same place, no judge, under the evidence rules, you can't put that on a prior act to prove what he did on this particular occasion. But if he did it every single day and it was his habit and custom to do it, and you could put on enough examples of him doing it, sometimes you are allowed to put on what I'm going to describe as habit and custom testimony. I want to make sure I'm getting this right, because one of my sons is a law school professor and teaches evidence. I don't want to get this, in case he listens, I don't want to have made a mistake. And so what we were able to do was, I asked her a very specific question, which was, if you were 18 years old and you wanted to leave, given the fact that you were 18 and you hadn't been sent there by a judge and you weren't legally required to be there, could you just get up and walk out? And she said, yes, there was a procedure and we would discourage you, but anybody who was over 18 could leave. And I then said to the judge, well, I have as many examples as you want, Judge, of people who were not allowed to leave. In fact, their usual practice was not allow people to leave. You know what, maybe a better way to make this point, Roberta, would be the Bill Cosby trial. Mm-hmm. The same issue with that trial, where he drugged the woman that he was charged with drugging a particular woman and sexually assaulting her while she was unconscious. And there were so many examples of him having done that to others that, as I recall, there was a big issue, and I think it will be the issue on appeal in this case, which was the judge allowing them to call a certain number of those other women to prove that that was his habit and his custom or his method of operation.
So how did Lulu Corter, who was 13, she had no behavior issues, no drug issues, never had a drink, how did she get admitted to kids?
It was not unusual for kids to be admitted to kids for what I guess is best described as prophylactic reasons. To understand kids, you have to understand that unlike the most tough love programs, kids didn't live there or sleep there. Kids in the program spent the whole day in, quote, therapy, sitting in these blue chairs, but at night they went home to the families of other kids and then came back in the morning. That meant, as a practical matter, that Newton had enormous control over what happened in all of what he called the host homes. And in addition, if you had a child at kids, you were required, everybody who lived in your home was required to attend family sessions, I'll call them, open meetings, they were called, every Tuesday and Thursday night. And so it was very common for Newton to convince parents that other kids in the family that weren't doing anything, who weren't actively using drugs, were on the verge of that, and they needed to be in the program prophylactically. The problem with that was that in order to justify putting them in the program, they had to make up all kinds of lies about their behavior that simply didn't exist. And that's what they did. In Lulu's case, they initially made up that she had a behavioral problem, which was nonsense. The two things that got her into kids, if you're interested, this I remember pretty well. She had gone with her friends to the mall, and she had bought, with money she had saved or gotten from her mother, she had gotten a pleather skirt, pleather being plastic that looked like leather. And she had worn it on several occasions, and she wore it on a second occasion to the program after being told it wasn't okay for her to wear it. And then the second thing she did was that she asked her mother, or maybe she did, I don't remember if she just asked or actually did, with her hair, she got a tail in the back of her head. So she had a blonde sort of streak that went back the head of her head. And Newton considered both the pleather skirt and the tail to be druggy behavior. And that was enough to get her into the program.
Mm-hmm. And what I didn't realize is how much her entire family was wrapped up in kids. Not just her and her mother and her brother, but also her sister.
That's absolutely true. And I'll tell you, when I worked on this case and during the period of my life when I sort of became obsessed with learning and then telling this story, there was a critical moment for me. And it was long after I realized that kids program was cultic and that Miller Newton was actually a real deal cult leader in Jim Jones' sense of that word. And it was when I realized, and I got this from somebody, a psychologist I went to talk to who had treated a couple of kids that were there. And he said, what you have to understand is that the people that were in the cult, at least initially, were not the kids. They were the victims. The people that were in the cult were the parents. These were people who had reached a point in their lives when they were scared or worried about what their kids were doing, looking for a simple answer, or at least an answer they could deal with, to a problem that seemed intractable to them. And Newton provided a simple answer if you just trusted him. And some of these parents wound up trusting him, and they wound up joining his cult. Later, things changed, because at some point some parents figured it out, but by then the kids had become his disciples and they broke off relations with their parents. Some kids figured it out and ran away, and their parents remained disciples of Newton. One of the people that testified at the trial was a young woman whose father had put her in the program, and she testified on video at the trial, as I recall, one of my favorite people. And she finally ran away, got away, and made it to Kansas City where her mother lived. Her parents had been divorced. And her father was so brainwashed by Newton that he, with a group of parents together, flew out to Kansas City and tried to pick her up on the street and bring her back to New Jersey. She was well past 18 at that point. The father was that brainwashed by Newton. One of the great things to me that happened at the trial, and doing this with you was bringing back all those memories. Her father wound up becoming a witness also, because later he put several of his other children in the program. And at one, if you know the story of the trial, I had decided to never use the word cult and never talk about cults and just tell the story. And that's what I did. But the father testified, and after his testimony was over, a juror asked a question. In New Jersey, we have a procedure I think in criminal cases as well, but where after a witness is done, after the lawyers have examined and cross-examined the witness, jurors who have questions can write their questions on an index card or a piece of paper and hand them in to the judge. And if the judge thinks the question is a reasonable question, the judge asks the question on behalf of the jury. And after the father testified, I don't even remember the issue on which he was testifying, but after the father testified, the one juror handed in a question, and the question was, did you ever feel like you were brainwashed? And the father told the story, and the father said, yes, I did. And he told a story I hadn't heard before. And the story was that at that point he had 3 kids in the program. His mother, the father was the superintendent at an apartment house in Queens, which is where the kids were from. And so he'd spent his whole life now driving to New Jersey every day back and forth with these kids. And now his mother had gotten old, and his mother moved in with him. And because now his mother was living in his house, she was required to visit the program and see the program and theoretically be evaluated by the program. And so she went with her son, the father of these kids, to visit the program. And when she was done and she left and they were driving home, she said to him, Fernando, that was his name, Fernando, this is not a good place. There's something wrong here. You need to bring your children home. This is not right. And he listened to her, and he thought about what she said, and he knew exactly what he had to do as a result. He had to go and tell Miller Newton what his mother had said. And so he did that. He went back to Miller Newton and told him what his mother had said. And Miller Newton told him exactly what he had to do, and of course, he did it. And what he had to do and what he did was tell his mother she couldn't live with him anymore. She had to live someplace else, because he had to keep his kids in the program to save his kids.
Yeah, they had so much control over who you could talk to, who was in and who was out. I just hear my audience saying, well, isn't tough love good? Maybe this is just like a military school. What made the difference? What crossed the line with kids? What made it an abusive program?
God, I don't know where to start.
Right,
so
I
much
know.
of it is well, I'll start with a variety of things. And that was interesting because Miller Newton was so good at using language and playing with language so that you couldn't get to the heart of it. But here's what the heart of it was. There were no checks and balances in the program at any stage in any way. So there was no check and balance that controlled which kids got admitted to the program. So that you had kids like Lulu in the program who had never used drugs and had no behavior problem of any kind. That's the first thing. The second thing was, in the first and second phases of the program, you didn't get to go to school. Not only didn't you get to school, you couldn't read, you couldn't write, you spent your entire day in these blue chairs and then motivating, it was called, to convince people that you had learned your mistake and were going to do better. And that would eventually entitle you to go to school. Then the system for deciding when you went backwards in the program was completely irrational. Kids got sent back to earlier phases of treatment for the most irrational of reasons. One girl who I represented, actually the first client I represented, progressed to a stage where she was allowed to go to a local community college. And she went to the community college and she came back and attended one of their sessions like the next day after going to school the prior day. And she told them that the day before she had really decided she was hungry and wanted a snack. And she bought some Oreos from a vending machine at the school. And as a result of her honesty and acknowledging that she had done that and for even thinking about doing it, she violated her first step and they pulled her out of school and back to the first phase of treatment. It all sounds so crazy, and it in fact was. It's all only explainable if you understand the control that Miller Newton had over his victims.
There's also a culture of confession. So, I mean, how does Lulu advance the program when you don't know why you're there or you have nothing to confess? You know what I mean?
Everybody who was there was caught in the catch-22. The only way that you could advance in the program was by admitting that you belonged there. And once you admitted that you belonged there and that you had these terrible problems and that you were dealing with them, you could begin to advance. It created a terrible problem for the kids that didn't belong there, and it created even a bigger problem for the kids, A, that didn't belong there, and B, that didn't have the kind of intellect or cunning or experience to figure out the madness. Some kids at some point figured it out, and then they were able to lie their way out of the program and manipulate the program because they were smart enough. But for the kids that were really, the kids that belonged there the least for a whole variety of reasons, had the least chance, and they wound up being there forever and just getting recycled. And that's how Lulu wound up there for 13 years.
And they kept Lulu out of school. How did they do that?
So they did it in a variety of ways over the years. For kids that, Lulu stayed there till she was 28, as I recall. So in the later years, it wasn't a problem keeping her out of school. For the kids that were of school age and needed to be in school, they initially had letters signed by the medical directors, in some cases with a stamp that they got from the medical directors, in some cases by one way or another telling people that they had medical problems and needed to be out of school. Schools did such a terrible job of keeping track of kids that the kids in many cases just got lost. But then when kids got a little further on to the third phase of treatment, they formed a relationship with this awful school located in Bergen County, New Jersey, where they could send the kids and then pull the kids in and out, and that school didn't ask any questions. So it was one lie, one crazy lie after another, all based on Miller Newton's manipulations and the belief of the people in the program that they were really doing something good and important, if not revolutionary.
There was an interesting moment in your deposition of Ruth Ann where you asked her if you ever thought a child was lying to advance in the program, and she said no.
I'd forgotten about that moment. That was why she was such an easier person to examine than him. Because kids lied all the time. They made things up all the time in order to advance. And they lied their way in. I mean, the way kids got into the program, the whole thing was such a remarkable con. I mean, I don't know if this became clear at the trial, but the way they got kids into the program was kids would be brought by their parents to the center. Kid was usually brought there under false pretenses and didn't know why they were being brought. After they got there, the parents and the child were separated, and the child was put in one room. The parents went to another room. The child was then put in a room with kids who were further along in treatment who had a questionnaire. And the questionnaire involved what the child's life was like, what drugs they were using, what kind of, were they lying, what kind of conduct they did. And if the child said, well, I don't do that, or I don't do this, or I don't do that, the kids that were interviewing would say, you're lying. And they, in some cases, push them around and be in their face until they admitted right at the beginning doing all kinds of stuff they didn't do or exaggerated whatever it is they had done. And they went on and on and on. The most glaring example was one poor kid who I represented, who was there for 4 years, as I recall, who didn't speak English and was interviewed by a couple of kids who didn't speak Spanish. But that didn't stop him from completing the interview and putting down all kinds of things he did and getting him to sign his name. In the other room were the parents with presumably a drug counselor, and they would put down what they thought their child was doing, and they would do their best to describe whatever it was that concerned them. And then the forms that the kid had completed would be brought in to the parents. They'd be shown the form, and they were told, look, it's so much worse than you thought it was. Your child's conduct is so much worse than you thought it was. Your kid is in desperate need for help, and you need to decide right now whether to admit him to the program or not. This is your only chance. You can't go home and think about it. And so either admit him and we'll save his life, or take him home and everything is going to go, it's going to fall apart.
Wow.
The parents would admit him. The parents would go home crying, but maybe feeling better because they finally done something good to save their child. And now the child is in the program. And the only way they can advance in the program, the only way they can earn talk, which was the first thing you had to do, get out of the first phase, move on in the program, was to admit that they belonged there and that they had done the things they said they did. So you could see what happens next, what the catch-22 is. That's, even as I talk about this now, so many years later, I find it hard to believe this really happened, but it really did.
And also, Lulu Corter's, a lot of her records were missing. What do you think happened to that? I know you had some of them seized.
Yeah, we did.
What do you think happened to those records?
The records were kept in a... Miller Newton was desperate for credibility, so he wanted his place to look like a real medical place that provided medical care, so he had all these procedures for records. They were kept by and large in a haphazard and ridiculous fashion. That's part of why the records weren't there. A lot of them were thrown away when they had to close in one location and move to another. I think some records got destroyed. In Lulu's case, by then I knew what the game was, and so I got the state insurance fraud department to seize the record, and we got our records from them rather than from the program. So we actually had some records.
So was that a help? I mean, she had no intake records. Was that helpful to make your case, or was it not helpful?
I know. The story, well, let me back up. You asked a question a little while ago about tough love programs and whether some kids belonged in tough love programs or needed help. And if somebody really needs help and they really are seriously abusing drugs, you have to do something to help them. And I certainly agree with that. So it was important for me to be able to demonstrate that the clients that I represented, at least, didn't belong in any kind of tough love program at all. They belonged in school, maybe in a special needs program, but they belonged in school, not in this program. And so the admissions, I spent a lot of time focusing on the admissions records and proving that there was absolutely no reason for Lulu in particular to be there. So the admissions records were enormously important. I actually don't remember. What I remember is that when I deposed Miller Newton, he said he didn't recall why she was there. But you'd need the records, and they didn't have the records, so I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, but I'm sure if I had the records, they would explain it. That was basically his lie for that. So I was very focused on why she was sent there and the absence of any records to demonstrate a reason for her to be there.
You asked the jury for compensation for the years kids took from Lulu, not punitive damages. Why?
Because for the most practical reasons of all, because punitive damages are only important if the person, the individual you're going after has money that you can collect. And there was, fortunately for me, Miller Newton in his quest for credibility had purchased insurance, malpractice insurance, for most of the years that he operated, and also had medical directors who had their own insurance. Punitive damages would not have come from the insurance company. They would have come from Miller Newton. And he had bankrupted himself at that point. I don't remember exactly what the timing is. I think when I tried Lulu's case, he was still in New Jersey, but later he actually went into bankruptcy in Florida, individual bankruptcy. And so there was nothing to be gained by seeking punitive damages.
I'm just going to ask you something. You mentioned that you never mentioned the word cult when you tried this case. Why not?
That's a great question, Lulu. And the answer is that when I realized at some point early on, I realized this absolutely was a cult and that you couldn't understand this. This happened because it was too crazy unless you understood that it was a cult and that Newton was a cult leader. But what I found was that if I used the word cult or I used the word brainwashing, it wouldn't advance the ball for me because people would then wind up arguing about what is a cult and what isn't a cult and is this a cult or is that a cult. The word wasn't helpful. But that when you see a real cult, when you're talking about something that really is a cult, if you just describe in detail what it was that happened there and how it happened and how people were manipulated and what they did and what they agreed to and what was done to them, the person listening will decide it's a cult. Because people know what a cult is when they see one. People know that the people that in Guyana all those years ago who drank the Kool-Aid and killed themselves only drank the Kool-Aid because they were part of something that didn't make any sense and they were following a false guru. The prosecutors who prosecuted the Nexium cult and Keith Raniere in particular didn't have to use the word cult for the jury to understand that these women who let themselves be branded in their pubic areas did it all for some reason that really is difficult for most of us to understand most of the time, and that it's because it's a cult, and they never used the word cult either. So that's the answer. I thought using the word cult would be a distraction, and that if I just told the story, I would get where I needed to go.
In your opening statement, you warned the jury that Miller Newton might sound impressive. It's just an interesting part of your opening statement. You say, if we're right and this is a con, what was he doing with Lulu all those years? But were you worried that he would sort of charm or con the jury?
Yeah, I was. And so I had at that point taken his deposition on many occasions. I knew who he was. He knew me and I knew him. We developed this interesting relationship over the years. We hated each other, but we also understood each other. I have an interesting anecdote about that if you want to hear it.
Yeah, I do.
So at one point, I took his deposition, and on a couple of occasions, to show him that I knew the stuff I was going to be asking him about. In this case, having to do with 12-step programs for eating disorders. I had brought a book with me that I knew he was going to refer to, and I just put the book on the table, and I never asked about it. The next time when I came to his deposition, I realized that he was looking at the book. The next time I came to the deposition, I brought a copy with me of Heart of Darkness, the great Joseph Conrad book about a cult leader. And I just laid it on the table and I just left it there the whole time. And the next deposition I took after that, he brought a book and he left it on the table, and so I just wrote down the title. And when I went home, I Googled it. I think we were still already in a Google era then. And it was the story of a Russian Orthodox priest who was imprisoned after the Russian Revolution and stuck to his principles and never gave up, even though he was pilloried and humiliated and people insulted him and called him any kind of names, but he knew who he was and he never stopped believing in what it was he believed. And I'm convinced he brought that book for me. What I realized about him was that it was not easy for a lawyer to admit that he was a better witness than I was a lawyer. I thought I was a pretty good lawyer, but cult leaders are few and far between. The kind of person that could get people to do these incredible things, like what we're describing, happened to Lulu. And I decided that I needed to have the jury, eventually he would testify, but I needed the jury to hate him before he got on the witness stand, so that there was nothing that he could say that would make it better. So they weren't interested in anything he had to say. Because I didn't want to have to win my case by cross-examining him. I knew his techniques for getting through a cross-examination. I didn't know, getting ready for the trial, what the judge would be like. And that was why, in a civil case, you can call the other side as a witness. That's why I called his wife as my witness, to ask her all of those questions and put it on, so that jury would hate him by the time he took the stand. So yes, I was really afraid about his ability to con the jury. I think you have to, again, because I know you've done a couple of podcasts about NXIVM, and it's been on my mind as well. You have to give the devil his due. Keith, by the time the NXIVM trial was over, by the time the prosecution rested, there was nothing Keith Raniere could have done. Sure, he wasn't interested in hearing. There wasn't a good side to the story from his perspective. And that was what I had to accomplish. I didn't have the resources of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I didn't have sex branding, but I needed to tell the story so that the jury would hate it.
And your examination of Lulu Corter was really touching. You called her Lou. It was almost like a conversation between two friends. Was that because you just had such a close relationship up to that point? Or was it a technique to make the jury really like her or bring her out?
There was no technique. Lou was not in the trial. She was then not in the court for the trial. I didn't want her to be at the trial. It would have been too upsetting for her and too distracting for me. So during the trial, she stayed at a hotel nearby, and I spent time with her at the end of each day. And a woman who had been in the kids program for a while stayed with her at the hotel. And we just spent a lot of time talking. And I just spent an enormous amount of time thinking about what I could do and not do with her to examine her. By then I had known her for a few years, and Lulu was kept out of the world for 13 or 14 years. She's wonderful, but she had no ability to function in the world as we know it. And so she was my friend, and I just wanted to see the jury to see her as best as they could, as they could. And I don't remember a lot of technique. I know I couldn't have her on the witness stand for a long time. And Newton's lawyer was an insurance company lawyer, and absolutely a first-rate lawyer. Really good lawyer. Knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew not to try to cross-examine her aggressively, as I recall. I don't remember him cross-examining her aggressively. And we got her in the courtroom and out. That's what I remember about.
Yeah, it was that naivete really came across in her testimony. You also had a judge who seemed to judge, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name.
Gallipoli.
Thank you. Who really got it.
I've thought about him, and one thing I haven't done, and I really should do, because he's now retired and has been off the bench for a long time, is contact him when I think back on the trial. I'm an enormous fan of his. And I thought of him when I thought about the NXIVM case, and I watched and thought about the judge in the NXIVM case who reminded me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, me too.
Of Judge Gallipoli, reacting to it. And so here's what I saw happen in the NXIVM case, and I'll analogize it to what happened in the kids' cases. The judge in the kids' cases was a hard, tough, first-rate insurance defense lawyer before he became a judge. Well respected, and on the other side of cases from me. He had a reputation as a judge of being conservative, and I mean conservative in the best sense of the word. Not flamboyant, but lawyers had a lot of respect for him, and there was no question about who was in charge of his courtroom. Nobody pushed him around, and he knew malpractice law really well. And he believed, when he first heard about the case, what I think most people would believe, that either this was a place where people wanted to dump their children. The story didn't make any sense. And so he needed to be convinced. But once he became convinced, and he became convinced over the course of the trial, and he realized who Miller Newton was, and you could literally see him figuring it out in the courtroom. And when Mr. Calderon told that story I told you about the brainwashing, by then he got it. And it took all of his skills. I want to say this the right way, because Miller Newton always had a fair trial. But you could tell he knew who he was. Similarly, I have to believe that the judge in the NXIVM case was cynical about a cult case. And as the proofs came in, as he heard the story, you could see him reacting to it. Mm-hmm. And I went to 2 days of the trial and sat in an overflow room, and I was there the day that Lauren Salt testified. And I literally watched the judge watch her. She was as good a witness. If you wanted to prove something was a cult, all you had to do was watch her testify. That was one of the saddest things I've ever seen in the courtroom. And I watched, because for me it was a little bit like a busman's holiday. I watched the judge watch her, And I wasn't in the courtroom. I was watching it on a TV screen in an overflow room. But I thought about Judge Gallipoli when I watched him. And by the time he sentenced Raniere and Claire Bronfman, he gave Raniere an absolutely fair trial from my perspective. But once he got it, boy, he got it.
So could you have been successful with another kind of judge?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
By the end, I want to be fair to myself as well. I didn't have the power or the influence of the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, but me and my firm, we had a good reputation as lawyers. We didn't take, silly cases. We weren't there on a little automobile cases. And just as I knew the judge knew me and knew us. So I think we got a certain amount of respect. And the facts were so enormously powerful. I mean, by the time I tried Lulu's case, I'd been working on not much else for a few years besides these cases. I mean, they really dominated just like people that are in a cult, there wasn't a lot of separation between my personal life and my work life. That's what I thought about it all the time because it was such an incredible story and such a powerful story, and I was doing it essentially alone.
You describe yourself as obsessed during these times that you're trying these kids' cases. What obsessed you? Do you know what I'm saying? What kept you going?
Yeah, I do. I know what you're saying, and I want to think about how I want to answer it. I can answer it in a couple of ways. Without going into the details of this, part of what attracted me to the case was that I had a family member who had been in what I'd call a toxic group for her adult life, and so I was familiar with the idea and interested by it and fascinated by it. But that's only part of it. I think what happened to me was over the course of this time, I started meeting the victims. And I was the first person that hadn't been affected by it who sort of got it. And once I got it, I just wanted to hear more and more of the stories. People were still leaving his group as I was working on the cases, and they'd gravitate towards my office. Somebody who had been a witness on the other side during the first case was somebody trying to help me by the last. And it just had this powerful effect on me. The stories were that horrible, and the impacts and part of what was worse about the stories, and I think about this as it relates to the troubled teen industry more generally. Parents send their kids, good parents. I mean, there are some parents who I wouldn't give the time of day, but most parents who send their kids to these programs are doing it because they want something good for their kids, their children, and for their families. And these programs destroyed these families completely, in some cases irreparably, so there was no chance to put them back together. That's the worst thing about the troubled teen industry, is what it does to those relationships in the long run. And I felt like it made me feel, made me feel important. It made me feel like I knew something that most people didn't know. And I wanted to learn more about it. I'm just more interested in working on lots of other kinds of cases. So I just kept going. And I wanted to learn more about it and understand it. And if you think about the fascination with the NXIVM story, it's a fascinating story.
As fascinating as the story is, as I was reporting on NXIVM, the stories were so dark and so disturbing that in my personal life, I would get about, maybe come back from court, get maybe about 3 sentences in, and my boyfriend what happened. It was just so terrible and disturbing that he'd say, I've heard enough. I found it very isolating, is what I'm saying. Did you find this work at all isolating?
Yes. Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that. NXIVM is worse. I'd say that. Okay, NXIVM really was and is that dark. And it is the kind of thing that you really do, if you were involved in, need to get away from to enjoy a sunny day. So you're 100% right about that. In my case, I had so there was a lot of that in my family. I have a wonderful wife with less than no interest in this stuff, and that's probably saved me. Like your boyfriend, I knew she got that look if she's heard enough. In my office, there was an expression. I have this wonderful, wonderful assistant named Patty, my good friend, and I know her and she knows me is the best way I'm going to describe it. We were together for a long time. And I remember I'd start reading records, and she'd say to me, "Oh my God, are you going to be cauterized again today?" That was the expression the word she came up with, referring to Lulu. And I said, "I might be." Well, and she would say, "All right, I'll shut your door. Remember to have lunch. You're getting skinny." And that was, and that was it. But you know what? The other side of it was, as it relates to Nexium. I'll use Nexium as the example in your situation and Nexium in mine because I was on the fringe of it. I was not in a position, you weren't in a position to do anything about it.
Mm.
For the, other than report it and learn it and understand it. And if you understood it better, you would tell the story better in your work. But for the prosecutors, they were on a mission. They were looking, I told the story before. There was a night I got 3 of his victims who had been in the program agreed to meet me at a diner in New Jersey, and I met them for coffee, as I recall, and one of them had jumped out of a moving car to get away from the program in the last couple of weeks. One of them told me that Newton owed him $20,000 for wages, but that it would violate his first step, Alcoholics Anonymous first step, if he tried to collect the money. And the third had been asked to lie and say he worked at the program even when he didn't, so as to build up their senses because they were worried about losing Medicaid approval. And I think there was somebody in the parking lot waiting outside in case it turned out I was there to try to bring them back. And I remember driving home saying, "Oh shit." I mean, this is the frigging devil. This man is a monster. And I need to prove it and just keep going. Keep putting one foot in front of the other. And that was what I did for a lot of years.
And you also were a lawyer for some of the Nexium victims. And you talked about some of the defendants in the Nexium case also being victims because Ranieri, Allison Mack and Claire Bronfman.
Yep.
I guess because he spent so much attention on them and they became so under his control. Why does the defense of brainwashing seem to be so unsuccessful in court as a defense?
I think as it relates to criminal cases, I should be clear about this, because I have probably a minority view, so I should separate it into 2 parts. Mm-hmm. As it relates to those people. I'm not troubled by Claire Bronfman being sent for a significant prison sentence. Her money was used to do lots and lots and lots of awful and evil things. And she is central to the harm that Nexium did. And my reason for feeling that way is that I don't think in our society we can allow people to not be responsible for their criminal actions because of harm that was done to them, of any kind. So that would include Patty Hearst, who robbed banks after being kidnapped and locked in a closet for a while, but ultimately joined her captors. It includes the women who were part of Charlie Manson's cults and killed people. It includes even the young boy, Lee Malvo, I think his name is, who's serving a life sentence, although it may get reduced, who was the stepson of the Baltimore sniper, who killed people. You can't have a civilized society and let people who do horrible things to innocent people not pay the criminal consequences. And that's why the brainwashing defense doesn't work, and why the not guilty by reason of insanity is probably not an unreasonable standard to explain conduct. There are lots and lots and lots of people raised in horrible conditions who ultimately steal, and we punish them for stealing, even though their stealing something is explained by what they were subjected to as kids. And I'm not sure it should be different with brainwashing. My sympathy for Claire Bronfman and Allison Mack and goes to something different, to some extent legal and to some extent not legal. And it's this. Ranieri really, really was good at what he did, to say the least. He was a master manipulator of people, and look at what he got people to do to satisfy his perverse needs. And he was smart, calculating, but also intuitive about what he needed to do to get people to do what he wanted. And there was nobody, and so the more he worked on you, the more he could convert you into I'll use the word deployable agent, somebody who would just do his bidding without thinking. And it was my impression during my limited period of involvement that he didn't work, there was nobody he was more focused on or worked harder on than Claire Bronfman. So when it comes to the civil area, and people are now, who were Keith Raniere's victims, start talking about suing her for harm she did to them, I have trouble with that. Because I'm not sure she wasn't they were brainwashed, and I'm not sure she wasn't the biggest victim of all. Nobody was more harmed by him than she was. And that distinction is a meaningful one for me. Similarly, Allison Mack, I don't know that people are going to be after her for her money because I suspect she doesn't have much at this point. But if you see those awful, awful videos of her talking to Keith Raniere and the expression on her face, and you know that many of those women were recruited into this awful situation, not by anything Raniere did, but by wanting to feel the way it looks like Allison Mack feels on those videos. I wind up feeling sorry for Allison Mack and feeling like she's the biggest victim of all. I don't want to get into a competition about who's. I'll simply say that I suspect that Raniere worked harder, Claire Bronfman and Allison Mack, than probably anybody else.
You say you're writing about NXIVM a lot now?
I stop and I start. I'm actually writing more about. Actually, what I've been writing about lately is Lulu. It's good that we're talking. I've gotten back to thinking about Lulu and her life, and then the troubled teen industry stuff is now interesting me again because it's back in the news. It looks like, I was very involved in what I'm going to call activism around the troubled teen industry during the years after the kids cases, and then I sort of moved on in my life. Now there are enough smart, coherent people that were young people and not so young now that was in those programs who seem to be organizing effectively to expose the negatives associated with them. So I'm sort of putting down on paper some of my stories of what happened to me in that world.
How did it change your worldview? How did working on these kids' cases change your worldview?
I think I've always been a little bit of a contrarian, and I never got rid of that notion I had when I was young about what lawyers, are supposed to do. And if you're lucky enough to know a story that's not generally known and can use your skills to tell it, it makes you feel good about yourself, right? In order to be able to tell it. I would turn it around on you in the following sense. If there are it's fun to figure out something that other people don't know and feel like you really understand it, and then be able to talk about it, even if it leaves you sort of alone. Alone is not such a bad place to be most of the time. So I'm I don't know. I don't think I answered your question.
No, I think you answered it very well.
But I think about when you decide you're going to have a podcast in which you're going to take somebody who lots and lots and lots of people think one thing about, and you say, it's not true. They really did it, right? There's something, why do you do that? It touches something in you, right? For you to be right, and to have everybody else be wrong. That's not a bad quality. Better than going along with the crowd, right?
Yeah. I just hate PR and I hate cons. So, I get angry. Okay. I mean, my anger is part of the thing that motivates me. So, but you're right. It does.
And for me too. There you go. A con is a con. I second what you said about cons. I mean, cons really they need to be exposed. And if you're lucky enough to expose one, I'd say it differently. I wasn't the most experienced lawyer when I tried that case. Very, 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 very far from it. My partner had been the big deal in my firm. I sort of stepped up to do these cases. But if there's one thing I believe, and I think when I summed up, it's not easy for me. There's a lot going on. But I think the first thing I said was the truth matters. And the truth really matters. There's one thing I believe, it's that the truth matters. And I really believe that the truth sets us free. It takes us where we need to go. And that's why, like what I said about Claire Bronfman. I loved your podcast about the Claire Bronfman sentencing. And I know what it was she did and how little there is behind, how gone she is, so to speak. But I also think have a need to tell the truth about what happened to her.
Okay, this is a good place to stop it. Thank you so much for telling me about it.
Okay, well, thank you so much.